Hi, I'm Elise Chaffins, and today I'm joined by directors Ben Braun and Chiaki Yanagimoto to discuss their new documentary, Aum, The Cult at the End of the World. Thank you both for taking time to speak with me today.
Thank you
Thank
for having
you.
us.
Absolutely. So, can you talk a little bit about what drew you to this story?
Sure. I'll start because I think my story is a little bit more obvious from outside. I was born and raised in Japan, and this group Aum is known for, they came into spotlight really when the Tokyo subway gas attack happened. And when it happened, I was still in middle school, so I was still too young to understand what actually happened or who these people were. But the group's largest headquarters was in Yamanashi, where I grew up. It's a countryside, peaceful town. And, I remember my parents or all the parents, telling their kids, be careful for these people roaming in the mountain in white robes. So that was a really vivid memory in my childhood. As an adult, when I looked back, I realized how little I knew about what actually happened and who these people were, but also more importantly, why it happened. So, when Ben and I sat down in Toronto in 2019, we started talking about Ohm, and I thought we thought it was a really interesting story and worth exploring.
Yeah,
For me,
absolutely.
I think it's a subject I've been interested in for a very long time, like predating my work in the documentary space. I was in New York on 9/11. As a young kid. My school was actually right next to the World Trade Center. So it's like up close and very, personal, that incident at a young age. And I think it just kind of formulated a lot of my worldview to some extent. And I think kind of put this idea in my mind that there are just things going on that you aren't aware of and they could someday affect you. And it's kind of what drew me to this story, because I think it's one that as you examine it, it's so interesting the way the group was looked at in Japan versus what was actually going on with it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think the documentary takes a really strong look at the mixing of religion and politics. Can you speak about some of the dangers that you saw, as you were working on this documentary and researching everything?
I think in terms of the religious element of it, I think kind of the point that some way through the film we make is that that's actually not an uncommon phenomenon. It's always been intertwined with politics all over the world. I mean, going back a long time, whether it's in Europe or America. And I think what was kind of interesting about you know Ohm in Japan is that it's very specifically kind of more Christian in origin than it would be to I mean, I know it's like a Buddhist yoga sect, but a lot of their ideology was kind of pulled from, you know, European Christian sort of storytelling about the apocalypse. And that's what Asahara kind of weaved into his teachings. And I think in a certain way, maybe you see how much more dangerous that is. Um, I mean, as one of our characters in the film kind of put it, Japan never had a king or a queen or a god to kill in the name of
Hmm.
until sort of the late 1800s and up through the Second World War. And Asahara sort of pulled from that very specifically, and also kind of weaved in the sort of kind of Christo authoritarian sort of element to it. And I think we can see the end result was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also like in Japan, as a whole, we're not super religious culture to begin with. There's no like super strong presence of or dominance of like Christianity or even Buddhism. There are, people who don't really have religion. There are many of them in Japan. And I think what's interesting is, yes, it is a religious group that, started as a religious group or became a religious group. But also, I think it has a lot to do with Japanese mentality of like not having a strong sort of religious leader. And a lot of people, especially like highly educated people in that specific era, was sort of like looking for a presence, a strong leader to follow. And of course, sometimes it works in a positive way, but I mean, in this case, obviously, it worked in a very dangerous, lethal way.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you also in the documentary point to ways that the media kind of softened the image of Asahara and just generally. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think in a certain way it isn't that complicated. It's just they were a huge phenomenon. I mean, it's hard to think of an exact comparison point in America today, but like if you think about the nature of like the popularity of like certain like talk show hosts where like people look to sort of authority and like ideology from entities outside traditional media, like that is sort of the same kind of impact Asahara had. He's somebody like kind of outside the, you know, accepted channels who had a strong message and kind of found an audience for it. And it was so popular that I think without really doing a lot of digging, the media just sort of hoovered it up as they were kind of like it was just great viewership. And I think what went unnoticed is what we explore in the earlier part of the film, that even as that was going on, I think one perception of Aum is that it started as something and evolved into something much worse. The truth is that a lot of really terrible things were going on within this group, like even as they were doing the talk show circuit.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, yeah, exactly how Ben put it. But just to add to that, I think that makes it even more scary. I remember seeing them on TV before the subway attack, years before the subway attack. They were on, running election campaign, and I remember seeing them on TV and on the talk shows. I remember seeing them on TV. I remember seeing Asahara on TV, and just looking back, like realizing that all those horrible things were still happening in the background, that makes it even scary. And that also makes me think, like, what is going on in the world today that we're not aware of?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and just to kind of come off of that, near the end, you kind of draw parallels between what happened in Japan with Aum and what's happening in the United States and in other countries. What kind of, I assume this is kind of what made you want to highlight that concern. Can you talk just a little more about that?
I think that's something, truthfully, when we first started digging into this story, it was before the pandemic.
Hmm.
And I think we were both really interested in it for the personal reasons we mentioned. But, a lot of those themes and their relation to the story and how it made the story like relevant to today's world, like that evolved as we were making it. This sort of dual narrative that emerged around like the pandemic, the dual narrative around like Trump and politics, like it all started seeming very familiar. And then, of course, right around when we had started editing, the Capitol riot happened. And I think after that, it just seemed sort of like, wow, this is so like strikingly familiar to what happened with to the point where it kind of really became almost the sort of allegory and the sort of like ability to look at as like a mirror image to America at that point. 2021, 22 felt like that is really the core takeaway and relevance of revisiting this tale. But
Yeah.
it just evolved very naturally as we were making it.
Yeah, because I'm sure you could kind of like see some parallels between, and not like one for one, but between QAnon and I think there could be some
Yeah,
similarities there.
it's funny. We never thought much about QAnon, to be
Hmm.
honest. Like QAnon sort of, I mean, I think to us, I mean, like where the one to one is like after the election in 2020, like
Hmm.
there were things that the president was saying at the time that Asahara ended up like, or previously had said word for word after their
Oh,
failed
wow.
election bid. And I think that was much more the kind of tie-in for us more than QAnon. Because QAnon sort of evolved a little bit after that. I felt like became more mainstream after that. But certainly there's parallels, of course, and I think it's just like this sort of scary nature of how people can just buy into the idea that something is going on, or in the case of something's coming, the apocalypse is coming, that like scary the way people can really just buy into that.
Yeah. Yeah. The film includes obviously interviews with people who had family members who were involved with Aum. And I'm sure that that can be really difficult emotionally to kind of navigate. Can you just talk about as filmmakers how you process your own personal feelings about hearing some of these stories and your own like personal connection to this while trying to stay somewhat, objective as you're telling this story?
Yeah, of course. I think, when we started, researching who we should talk to, and we started listing up, all these subjects that we wanted to speak to. And as we started reaching out, what was actually surprising to us but was they were really open and kind of excited to talk about, well, not excited in a positive way, but like they were really willing to share their stories, because not a lot of people actually approached them in a way that we did. And we just wanted to hear their stories. And I think when they are approached by Japanese media, there's always a certain narrative that these media want to cover. And, they were sort of tired of, sharing their stories in that way, because they know how they're going to report it. And our stance was really, tell us what happened, tell us what you lived through. And a lot of the subjects was very, very open to talking about it to us. And I hope, by sharing this film with a wider audience, I hope they feel like their stories are rightfully told to the audience, to the people in Japan, but also like in the West, where not a lot of story, at least their stories, are told in a way that we did.
Yeah. Well, I thank you both so much for taking time to speak with me today. I just really appreciate it. I appreciate the film and the message that it's bringing here. So thank you
Thank
both.
Thank
you.
you.
We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a
Thank you.
great day.
You too.
Thank you.